So here we are entering into the 20th century, and of course we need to deal with the Fauves. It's traditionally the first movement we deal with in the 20th century, and of course this is coming out of Europe, more specifically France. But before we get there, let's talk about some of the background. We have, of course, the turn of the century, which is a time of experimental fervor, both in terms of industrialization, aircraft, cars, electricity, but also artistically. And these two elements will play off of one another to create this very emboldened generation of progressive artists. We also see a distinct increase in the number of movements and a decrease in their duration due to the same innovative technology and developments that we see in communication, because of course communication is speeding up rapidly. At first, I apologize for this side, at first communication is at the pace of a person walking or running or maybe a horse. But as we move into the 19th century, suddenly it's the speed of a train or a telegraph. And as we move into the 20th century, it gets faster and more commonly available. We see radio in about 1909. We see the telephone and the telegraph in the middle to end of the 19th century. We also see a rise in non-Western art, more specifically an interest in non-Western art, mostly African. This is going to be termed Primitivism. It's something we're going to be dealing with throughout the first part of modern and contemporary. And the reason that Africa is so important is the European countries have split up and colonized Africa. Primarily, we're talking about France, England, Germany, Italy, and Belgium. And as they split it up, what they're doing is they're looking at these African cultures, they're looking at them as uncivilized, but then they're assigning all sorts of characteristics that have no real connection to what's actually happening in Africa. But we'll deal with that later on. So this, of course, brings us to the Fauves themselves. And the Fauves are named the wild beasts, or Fauves, by Louis Vauxhall. And they first come to prominence in about 1905. What they're going to do is they try to separate themselves from representational realism. In other words, they see no reason to represent the world around them in a realistic fashion. Remember the problems with the camera. The camera can do that already really well on its own. They don't need to compete with the camera. So they go a whole different direction. So what is Fauvism? Well, they're combining the immediacy of Impressionism with the color and emotion of Post-Impressionism. Color will no longer describe external reality, but rather color describes the artist's emotional experience of reality. So in other words, he will assign a color to an object based on his emotional response to the object. Oftentimes, what we're seeing is the artist's view of reality. Because they're seeking personal authenticity, we never see a truly cohesive movement. Each artist is working in their own direction. So Fauve is another broad term. It's like post-impressionist. There isn't a really good definition for it. They did, however, leave a legacy in which they extended the bounds of representation. Now we're going to see a lot of movements that do this. They're going to keep pushing those bounds of what's acceptable in art and in representation. And as they do so, we move closer and closer to what most of us would view as abstraction. They also conceived art as a creation free from narrative or symbolism. So they don't feel the need to tell a story, and they don't feel the need to use traditional artistic symbols, which is why Fauvism starts to get into a realm where a lot of students look at it and go, wow, I don't understand it, because you're looking at it through a lens of pre-19th century art or pre-20th century art, where you're looking for that story, where you're looking for that symbolism. It doesn't exist here. So this is a whole new way of looking at the world.